So the first one is incoming webhooks. So just a quick definition of a webhook. A lot of services have a hook that you can define that when a particular action happens, it will send to an HTTP endpoint. So we're taking our webinar today as the example. When a certain person registered for the webinar or when the webinar ends, Livestorm is going to send us a webhook that says this person registered. We didn't have a Livestorm integration at first because it's kind of a new tool for us, but we wanted to ingest this data to make sure that those events were on people's profiles. That way we're able to segment, do much more personalized things with it. So now we're going to dive in. Oh, we're going to dive in and actually get into some code. All right. This is the whole dashboard. It just gives you kind of a general overview of what's going on. What I'm first going to do is go to the connector screen and add a connector. So these are all the connectors that Hull has. I'm going to search specifically for incoming webhooks. Install, there's definitely some documentation there. Going to install an incoming webhook connector. So what an incoming webhook connector will provide for you is a link to a point that the service that you want can hit with data. So in this case, Livestorm has an integrations page where you can open up a custom webhook setting and paste in this link. So the first thing we have to do is figure out what kind of data we're ingesting. And so what I'm going to do quickly is show you just how I set up some mock data for using in our webhooks. So I use a very typical tool called Postman. I pasted the URL into the post URL, and then I copied some data from the mock data that Livestorm gives that they say they're going to be sending that when somebody registers. So here we see Angela's email. We see a few other custom fields we were pulling. You see what webinar it is. So I hit send, and then we go back to the webhook screen. Okay. And so some of this is a little pre-prepared so that we don't face any connectivity issues, but essentially you go back to the code screen and now you see exactly the data that I just sent to the webhook. So now what we have to do is figure out how to take that data and make it meaningful on the user profile. So I'm going to take some code that I've written and I'll walk you through it real quick because it's not too complicated. So the first thing that we're able to do is call Hull user traits. So traits are what we talked about before. Traits are attributes on a user profile. They're not really time sensitive. They're not really behavioral related. It's things like first name, last name, company, job title. So what we do is we pick out how we want to identify the user. And in the second part of this series, we'll actually get much deeper into identity resolution. For now, we'll just pick email. So we pick email from this body, which is attendee.email, which is right there. And then we call a traits call with the traits that we want to put on the user. And we can see as we modify this code, the data on the right actually changes. So one of the features we and our customers really like is you're able to develop in real time and see exactly what the outcome of what you're writing in the code interface is. So the second thing that I'll show you here is a track call. So a track call essentially is a way to create an event on the user profile. So an event is typically some sort of user behavior, some sort of time-bound piece of information. An event consists of a couple different things, one being the event name and then the event properties. And as you can see here, I'm crafting a registered for webinar event. So I'm pulling certainly the company and the job title and a few other things, but also the referrer and the title of the webinar so that we can segment based off of if a person went to a couple different webinars. and then things like the UTM source of where the person was coming from when they registered for the webinar. And so I was actually talking with Angela about this right before this webinar. I like to pull in a little bit more than I need as long as it's self-contained. You don't want to pull in a ton of data to an area where lots of other data is being pulled into too. That creates other problems. But I typically like to get as much as I can because I don't necessarily know what I'm going to use up front. It does make me a little bit of a data hoarder, but as long as, like I said, as long as you can keep it kind of organized in namespaces and within the events, I think it's fine, and we can use them later for sure. And so I'll show you exactly what the attributes and the events look like now in the timeline. So here's Angela's profile. We've got a registered for webinar on the timeline, and we've got all of the properties that we set. And the great thing about this is once you've written it once, any webinar that we host in Livestorm now, we get all of this data on an ongoing basis. And then we'll see here at the bottom that these Livestorm attributes are there within the Livestorm group. Now, one other thing that I'll briefly touch on, because things like job title, for example, could be coming from multiple places. What we like to do as a first step is to unify the profile based off of the identity, which is the email. And then you have sort of different groups for each one of the services that you have. Then the second step is to actually unify the attributes themselves, which for job title, for instance, you might have a job title in the CRM, a job title that came through Livestorm. What the next step here, which we won't talk too much about in this webinar, is you want to be able to create a unified attribute as well. And we have a couple different strategies for that, like fallback, where your CRM is the highest priority, then comes the rest of them, or based off of which one changed in the latest. We'll talk about that, I think, in a subsequent webinar. So that kind of sums up the incoming webhooks portion.